Greetings, my dear truth seekers. It seems that the media is explicitly concentrating particular attention on the fighting in Ukraine and also focusing unhealthy attention on Taiwan, thereby trying to distract people from a more impending severe catastrophe that can dramatically change their lives. Despite the recent statement by the US President that the American economy is not in a bad enough position compared to the economies of other countries, and that journalists and ordinary citizens should not worry, the facts point to the opposite. The recent bankruptcy of another of the largest US banks, Silicon Valley Bank, and the decision of Fed Chairman Jerome Powell to urgently start lending to the remaining banks to save the country's financial and banking sector indicate not only the doom of the US currency but also the inevitability of a future economic catastrophe. All this time, the US government has been doing everything possible and impossible to change the situation and keep the dollar in the status of the world's main currency. Attempts by the US government to somehow rectify the situation are already taking desperate nature. It even got to the point that US President Joe Biden visited Saudi Arabia on a state visit and personally asked the Saudis for help in saving the dollar and increasing oil production, which would allow to reduce inflation in the country and stop rapidly rising prices. However, the geopolitical processes in the world and the radical policy of the globalists forced the Saudis to reconsider their prerogatives. The Saudis not only refused to increase oil production, but also said that from now on, oil on world markets will be sold for both Chinese yuan and Russian rubles. This was a real shock for the United States. All this time, the power of the US dollar, the status of the world's first economy, and the hegemony of the United States were maintained because oil on world markets was sold exclusively for American currency. The US response was a de facto declaration of war to OPEC. In early March, US senators prepared a bill that, according to Washington's idea, should destroy OPEC. This bill was named NOPEC, No Oil Producing and Exporting Cartels Act. Thus, the US government seeks to completely deprive OPEC of the ability to control oil markets, regulate and set not only prices for black gold, but also the amount of oil produced. Simply put, American courts will have the authority to challenge any OPEC decisions, and even arrest the decision-makers of this organization. So far, it is not entirely clear whether the US authorities will act harshly and also arrest the financial assets of OPEC oil-producing countries, or whether the matter will be limited to ordinary statements and threats. Whatever it may be, it is safe to say that the current US authorities have declared a real war on OPEC, led by Saudi Arabia. The current unstable state of the global economy and, in particular, the US financial sector forces Washington to act more harshly and radically. The rapid collapse of Silicon Valley Bank is a real omen of the coming economic catastrophe and the final end of the US dollar hegemony. Since 1983, the SVB has been a symbol of the resilience of the American financial system and the power of the Federal Reserve System. Looking back into history, it becomes clear how the United States was able to achieve this. Since the mid-70s, the United States has made every effort to lure Saudi Arabia to its side. And by the early 80s, the Americans managed to convince the Saudis to sell oil exclusively for dollars, and at the same time oblige the rest of the OPEC countries to do the same. Moreover, all this time, the Saudis also kept oil prices at a relatively low level, which was very beneficial for the United States and the rest of the Western countries. In return, Washington promised Saudi Arabia not only not to interfere in the internal affairs of the country, but also to provide military protection, including the supply of new technologies in the military sphere. As a result, the US dollar became the world currency, and the Fed could afford to print as much money as was needed. The situation began to change rapidly since the end of the 2000s. As I said earlier, the radical policy of the globalists, who have been in power in the United States for 3 decades, has done its job. Awareness of permissiveness and impunity, as well as the desire to subordinate other countries to the will of Washington, using not only sanctions but also blackmail, forced the Saudis to reconsider their attitude towards the United States, which is currently in power of globalists. And the world economic crises of 2008 and 2020 further convinced Saudi Arabia that it now needs new allies. Subsequently, due to economic crises, the Fed was forced to periodically lower the rate. In order to somehow fix the situation, the Fed artificially lowered the rate to 0.25% in 2020. However, this did not help, and inflation in the United States began to grow rapidly. The Fed urgently began to draw up an action plan. In order to somehow curb inflation, it was decided to stop the printing press and sharply raise the rate to 4.75%. The situation was also aggravated by the unwillingness of Saudi Arabia to help to already its former ally. The result was not long in coming. The U.S. banking system started getting a fever. Due to the increase in the interest rate, securities began to depreciate rapidly, which forced depositors to start withdrawing all money from their accounts. SVB alone lost all its cash from March 6 to March 9. And the bank's management was forced to declare bankruptcy. Against this background, Fed Chairman Jerome Powell faced a difficult task: either to launch a printing press and try to save the country's banking system, or to continue raising the interest rate, preventing inflation from reaching double digits. And seeing that the Fed began to distribute loans to the country's banks, secured by assets and government bonds, it becomes clear that Jerome Powell still launched the printing press in mid-March, without waiting for the Fed meeting that took place on March 22, according to the results of which, it was decided to raise the interest rate from 4.75% to 5% per annum. All these actions are rather desperate rather than consistent. Thus, by the present moment, the Fed as an organization has completely exhausted itself and has shown its insolvency. The fate of SVB will be repeated by many more banks in the United States. Unfortunately, the process of economic catastrophe and the collapse of the dollar cannot be stopped. This process is gaining momentum, and sooner or later will come to its logical conclusion, radically changing the lives of not only U.S. citizens, but also millions of people around the world.